Welcome back to another chapter of Rock Forever. We've got a very special show for you today. We're hitting you with both barrels. We've got two incredible gentlemen here that have written a book called Nothing But a Good Time. It is the uncensored history of the 80s hard rock explosion that we know so well. Please welcome Tom Beaujour and Richard Bienstock.
Hey, Jay.
Hey, how's it going?
Great to see you guys, man. I know it's like we were just talking about, it was an exciting time, and you kind of wonder if a lot of these bands since will be revered like so many of these bands from the 80s. They've seemed to have hung on, and even though we don't have MTV anymore, it was such a special part of a lot of our lives, seeing this decadence and this rebellion that's cranked out of the speakers. It's like I say, I moved to LA in 1980, having already been in the industry in the Seattle and Vancouver areas and different parts of the country. So I had a bird's eye view of kind of leading up to 1980, and of course the birth of MTV, seeing all this really come down. And I think in the book, like you asked Michael Anthony, we can pretty much blame Van Halen for a lot of this. A lot of these bands that hit the Sunset Strip and Brooklyn's clubs and all these clubs, they wanted to be Van Halen, man. But between David Lee Roth and Edward Van Halen, they really paved the way for a very decadent, explosive, in-your-face 80s. Why don't each one of you kind of tell us a little bit about your desire to write this book and how you guys teamed up as a pair?
Rich and I have worked together for years and years and years. We both started out at Guitar World magazine in the 90s, me earlier in the 90s, because I am older than Rich. He'll always be younger than me. I resent him for that. But we had been working on this. So we'd been working together on this stuff for quite a while. And we'd always talked about doing the book. Because this was the music that we grew up on, and it really captured sort of our passion and our imagination. And so we'd been tossing it around for, I don't know, how long would you say, Rich? Like 7 years, 5 years, 6 years?
I think even more than that, because we were both in the office at that time. So we're looking back at least a decade, actually.
Right. And this was just the music we grew up on. I was 15 in 86. Rich was 10. And MTV was just beaming this right at our brains. And like you're saying, like the explosive nature of it and the visuals and the guitar heroes, it all just connected with us.
Yeah, I think I would even add, and because it's funny, we've been talking about it in these types of interviews a lot, and we talk about the fact that this is a book we've been talking about writing for a while, and that almost undercuts it in a way, because it's not like we were two writers that were like, oh, this would be a cool topic, and we kind of know a little bit about it. But I think we could probably both say in some way, this is the book that I think we both were always sort of planning on writing in one way or another. Like it goes beyond having an interest and a background in this music, and like we both just love it to an insane degree and lived it to an insane degree, whether a lot of that was vicariously through our television sets watching MTV, but it was something that I think we kind of knew was going to happen at some point.
It's funny because people have asked me what we think like would be the next thing we would do. And I don't know if you have the same experience, Rich. I'm like, I have no idea. This is the only thing I've ever been interested in. No, we like other stuff as well, but like this to me is like has taken up such a huge part of my brain for such a large part of my life that it just seemed totally natural to do this book.
Yeah, it's a different era. When you look back between the birth of MTV and, like I say, with the advent of Van Halen and the fact that an American band could really become huge. Before that, they were all British or Australian or German, you know, between the Scorpions and Led Zeppelin and AC/DC and Deep Purple and Sabbath and everything. You had to go back to the early 80s, I'm sorry, the early 70s, you know, with the Aerosmith and Kiss, where an American band could actually be somebody. You know, a lot of those bands had kind of run out of steam in the, you know, mid 70s. And now all of a sudden, like I say, Van Halen exploded out of LA, you know, with this bright, in your face, you know, David Lee Roth and Edward and everybody. And, you know, obviously, what I'd love to do is kind of throw you some of these names and have you guys kind of capsulize what immediately comes to mind, and maybe a little thought or two of a story. Obviously, we want everybody to go out and get the book, and the book is huge. It's well over 500 pages. So many incredible interviews. I know you guys did over 200 interviews that make up this book, so we can kind of titillate them a little bit. And why don't we start with Motley Crue? Because when I moved here in 1980, I met Nikki Sixx and Tommy Lee and became an early promoter of theirs. They had just made Too Fast for Love on an indie basis. And I couldn't say more that the Trailblazers always came out of an era where there was nothing like it. It was all punk rock and new wave. It was the Knack and the Motels and the pop, and, you know, it was Skinny Ties or, you know, Black Flag or, you know, Circle Jerks. You know, when Motley Crue came out, they couldn't have been more out of fashion. And I know the same thing happened with, you know, Van Halen when they first came out. They were in the middle of punk rock and new wave, but definitely by the 80s, Motley Crue stood out like a sore thumb, you know. And I always say you got to be kind of an island upon yourself to really, you know, have that kind of trailblazer accomplishment. But after a while, it seemed like people were piling on. There was a million bands that looked like Motley Crue or Poison or, you know, Warrant or whatever. But if each one of you could say a little something about, you know, Motley Crue and you know, your impressions and a little bit of story.
Yeah, I think, well, in regard to Motley Crue and this book, I think one thing I'd say is, for starters, we're both huge Motley Crue fans. I mean, for me, they were the band that got me into this stuff. And they're clearly the band that's sort of at the beginning of all of this. And of course, this whole thing exists without Motley Crue, but you can certainly say that it doesn't exist in the same way, for sure. And I don't know that you can really say that with any of the other bands, Van Halen accepted, because they're sort of pre all of this anyway. But as far as how we treat Motley Crue in the book, and through Guitar World and Rolling Stone and Billboard and all these other places we've written for, Tom and I interviewed all the guys in the band before multiple times. But the question when it came to this book is like, okay, well, there are other Motley Crue books out there. This story has been told a lot. How can we tell it in a little bit of a different way, and in a way where people might learn something that they didn't otherwise know from all this other information that's out there? And part of the way we did that was by really going deep, especially on the early days, with people in their camp that you don't really hear from that often. Some of those people would be Bill and Wes Hine, who owned Green World Distribution and Enigma Records, which was their first label, and signed them to their first deal. Alan Niven, who later became Guns N' Roses manager, but actually also helped to discover Motley and bring them into that fold. People at Elektra who were there when they first came on board, the photographer who took their first ever photos, the multiple engineers who worked on Too Fast for Love, who just happened to be the house engineers at the small studio where they recorded the record. A lot of these were voices that, you know, I know as somebody who's been reading about this album for 40 years now, I've never heard these people say anything about it. So to get them on record going in depth about their views about what happened and how it all happened and what they thought of Motley and what the scene thought of Motley and just how this all went down, especially from a business perspective, was fascinating. So I think that was, you know, that was how we approached, I think, all the bands in the book, but especially a band like Motley or Guns N' Roses, where the story has been told a lot, and it's like, well, what can we add to this story that's going to you know, be the first time somebody hears this?
I was muted. Sorry. Is it switching over the camera? I can't tell.
It is.
Okay, great. To your point, one of the things that becomes clear as we went through interviewing people for this book, you know, Rich did a lot of the Motley interviews, but I talked to Tom Werman, who produced Too Fast for Love, and I interviewed Lita Ford, who was Nicky's girlfriend, you know, right sort of between the Too Fast for Love and Shout at the Devil. Did I say that Tom Werman produced Too Fast for Love? I'm sorry. Tom Werman produced Shout at the Devil. But anyway, everyone involved, also Bryn Bridenthal, their publicist, everyone involved acknowledges the fact that Nikki Sixx, from the very beginning of the band, had a total clarity of vision. Like Nikki Sixx knew what he was going to do with Motley Crue from day one. And the reason that they were able to like break through in a scene that was a lot of new wave bands and sort of labels that weren't particularly hospitable to their kind of music is because this dude had a plan. I mean, like he had an aesthetic vision of how the band should look. He understood how the band should sound. I think he probably had like a multiple album vision of like, we're going to do this one and then we'll do this one and that one. And, you know, he sort of showed real genius in putting Motley Crue together. Like he didn't go for the shreddingest guitar player. He went for like this guy who just like lays down these thick, you know, with Mick Mars, these like slabs of rhythm guitar and like cool leads, but like not like full on, he's not a full on shredder. And like with Vince Neil, he didn't go for the guy who could shatter glass with his voice, but he knew how to put together these ingredients to create a band that was just going to be undeniable and like cut through in a world where people weren't necessarily like, people didn't know they were looking for Motley Crue, but when they saw Motley Crue, they were like, oh yeah, this is awesome, you know? And he knew it. He knew he was taking a little from punk and a little bit from power pop and a little bit from glam. I think he had the whole situation like pretty much wired from the beginning. I don't know if you agree, but
yeah, no, when I first heard that record and felt the attitude, haven't been a big fan of the British 70s glam, like a band like Sweet, and then loving Cheap Trick, and then loving the power of the Ramones. You know, he kind of mixed all that together. They were fast, they had an attitude. It was like, you know, it was lean and mean, you know, like you say. Vince obviously was not an operatic singer, but he knew he was a chick magnet, you know. Tommy was just this young wild man on drums who, you know, like Mick, they were more attitude than they were just pure, you know, musicianship. They could all play, but Nicky definitely was the visionary and just had this concept like we're going to take the best of the 70s and, you know, punk, but we're going to put it in this attitude and we're going to live fast and hard, just like Too Fast for Love, the album cover. You know, they took that Rolling Stone sticky finger shot and put it right on Vince's crotch, you know, and just let the world know we're going to, you know, get laid, paid, and we're going to, you know, imbibe all that we can consume. And, you know, it just obviously attracted a lot of people. And once MTV kicked in by Shout at the Devil, I mean, it was all over.
I mean, that's the video that got Rich hooked. Was right, wasn't it, Rich?
It was, yeah. And then, and in the foreword in the book, that's what Corey Taylor says as well. Like the first thing he brings up is seeing the Looks to Kill video. And there's something, I've heard other people say that too. And there was something about it. Like I can remember seeing it as a 7-year-old for the first time. And that was it. And, you know, I've said in the past, there's some questionable things going on in that video, sort of like, I mean, everything that's going on in that video. But to a 7-year-old, like the guys look like superheroes. The riffs were enormous and like nasty, and it was just like it was all over from that moment.
And I think he was also really smart in a weird, I haven't thought about this that much before, but you know, the way that they dabbled a little with the Satanism was a good, you know, even on the interior covers, interior cover of Too Fast for Love, there's a, you know, like the candelabra. There's all like there's always a little bit of a vibe of that. I think he was really smart because I think that he, by doing that and then having a record like that, I think that he was welcoming like a lot of the metal people who might have thought, if not that they were too glammy or whatever, but it was like, hey, look, if you're into Dio and you know, and all this other stuff, you know, that's like a little bit witchy, we're also into that, you know. So like he really covered he had all of the bases covered.
Yeah, I got the feeling that they wanted to piss the parents off. They knew coming up, you know, that if the parents hate you and warn their kids about them, the kids wanted that much more. It's like, okay, maybe I got to hide it under my bed or only listen to it when I leave the house. But, you know, what your parents tell you you shouldn't be listening to is what you want. It's anti-authority as you come up as a teenager. You know, if your parents loved it, it's like, it's over. I don't want to like anything my parents like. I want to have something that pisses them off, you know. And we saw that from Alice Cooper in the 70s to Marilyn Manson in the 90s. You know, it's just age old. You know, they drew the line in the sand with the pentagram and all that. But yeah, they just had this wild abandon that we were gonna, like I say, screw more girls than anybody. We're going to take more drugs and alcohol than anybody, and we're going to rock harder. And it's this wild life that we lead. And, you know, we don't want anybody to tell us we can't do it. And, you know, they just flew under the radar. And once they hit, like I say, MTV, every, you know, bedroom in America was open prey to this anti-authority.
Yeah, totally.
Sure.
Well, let's talk about some of these other bands. And I know some of them kind of pale a little bit in comparison with the rebellion of the Crew. But around that same time, you had groups like Dokken, which George Lynch was around in the early days of Van Halen. You know, the three hotshot guitarists in LA, you know, was Edward Van Halen, Randy Rhoads, and George Lynch back there in 76, 77. And obviously George never got his due, didn't get the gig, you know, in Ozzy when Randy got it. And that's another crazy thing is how close a lot of these guys lived. You know, Edward from, you know, Pasadena was just like a stone's throw from Randy Rhoads in Burbank, and George in LA. They were all playing those same clubs, the Starwood, the Whiskey, the Gazaris, a lot of these same clubs. But obviously one of the things that fueled Dokken, and it probably haunted George forever, just like it did David Lee Roth, that the band was named after somebody. So, you know, when you're arguing with this guy like George constantly did, he reminded George, hey, man, the band is called Dokken, you know, get used to it. So tell us about your feelings about Dokken. And I know a lot of that was that tension between Don and George, but they had a melodic atmosphere where Don could do the ballads and George could still shred.
It's funny, you know, I interviewed Cliff Bernstein for this book, who managed Dokken back then and who, you know, now manages Metallica, and he also managed Tesla and Queensryche. And he says something funny. He's like, you know, if I had understood when I signed up Dokken how toxic the relationship was between Don and George, like how much those guys really hated each other and how like it would never be worked out. He's like, if I'd been a little bit older and a little bit wiser, I probably would have walked away from doing that project. I think it's one of the great mysteries in this book. Like there's no point in this book. We did a lot of, you know, we interviewed Don and George and all of the members of Dokken. There's really no point where like the animosity lets up. There's no point where they're like, oh, that was a good year. You know, like 85 was a good year. We were all getting along. It seems like the whole time they really just went through this entire era in like disliking each other, and but somehow being really successful. I mean, the question really is, we'll never be able to know because you can't go back and change things. Like, would Dokken have been more or less successful if Don and George liked each other? I don't know. You know, it could have been that they would have like never even got off the ground, but it is truly, I don't think they say one nice. Does either of them say a nice thing about the other guy in the book? Rich?
No, they don't actually, and they don't. You know, it's funny with the two of them, and I spoke to both Don and George for this, and like they're both pretty open about their feelings, but they don't attack the other just, you know, sort of carte blanche about everything about this person they don't like, but they go specifically into these things that happened. George obviously with the name of the band being a real sticking point for him, and ironically he left that band and started his own band, Lynch Mob, which he has now had to retire the name of that band, because, you know, I mean, it wasn't necessarily such a great name back in 1989, certainly not a good name now. So he's had band name issues over the years, but you know, you see in this book that it goes, I mean, these are two guys that clearly were just different personalities to begin with, and may have never gelled anyway, but you do see these things that happen, whether it's the band name or how these early songs were treated. And without really going into the story, but did Don steal a song that was George's, and all this other stuff? Who knows? Because one of the great things about the book too is you just get everybody's sort of view on what happened, whether it's Don and George or whether it's also Wild Mick Brown, who's the drummer, and, you know, or the guys at the label, or like Tom was saying, Cliff Bernstein, and no one really knows. I mean, ever since that's all happened and Don and George are sort of in opposite corners, I mean, Mick Brown has played in bands with George and he's played in bands with Don, and so has the bassist Jeff Pilson. So it's not like anyone's really taking sides, like this person is always wrong and this person was always right. Like, it kind of goes back and forth, and you can kind of probably chalk it up at the end of the day to the fact that these two were just oil and water. Like, they did not mesh from day one, but they had a sense that they could get further together than they could apart.
And it's also interesting, you know, what you were saying earlier about them, George being, you know, one of the big guys on the strip in the late 70s. There really are a couple different groups of bands in this era. You've got, you know, bands like Dokken or Twisted Sister or Quiet Riot. You know, even like to a certain extent, Motley, you know, Nicky was in LA a little bit in the late 70s. There are a lot of these bands that are guys who really started trying to get signed in the 70s, you know. So you've got several, that's something we investigate in the book, is that there's several generations of bands that we're talking about when we talk about the quote unquote glam metal era, or however the, you know, that we're encompassing. The first wave of these bands were really just contemporaries of Van Halen who didn't get signed at the same time as Van Halen. They just had to wait until 1983. So these guys are all, you know, a little bit older than people like Poison and Warrant, who come in later. And, you know, it's funny, even as a kid, I don't know if you felt this, Rich. I remember being like 14 or 15 and like looking at pictures of Dokken and just being like, these dudes are older, like a lot older. You know, you would like look at pictures of Poison or some of the younger bands, and you'd be like, oh, these guys are like, they're, you know, like my older brother. Mm-hmm. But like the Dokken guy, and so maybe they were, you know, maybe they missed their window a little too, and that's why they never were bigger. It's hard to tell. I mean, with Twisted Sister and Quiet Riot, they had their one big record, and then they weren't able to maintain either. And I've never really wondered, but now I am, if it's maybe that they just, you know, to kids in the record buying public, if they just seemed not like, that's one of us, you know. Doesn't explain Whitesnake, but
yeah, they were great you know, great players, great songwriters, but so much of that teenage, you know, angst was about what's hot and new, and you know, that attitude. Obviously, it showed when Dokken, you know, came on after Metallica on the Monsters of Rock tour. You know, at one point, Don asked Bernstein, you know, can we just go on before, you know, before Metallica, because they're throwing shit at us and everything after Hetfield.
I saw that tour. I saw that tour, and yeah, Dokken got. I mean, I don't think they put on a very good show that day. It was a giant stadium here in New Jersey. I don't remember them particularly performing well, but like they just got destroyed. Like between, actually, I think the best band that day, like in terms of energy, the Scorpions destroyed everybody. They came out and they were just like, and then it was just like boom, and you're like, oh my god, I've never seen this much energy in my life. But I don't think Dokken stood a chance on that bill. I'll probably get an angry letter about that, but that's my feeling.
Yeah,
I think
no,
they were-
it you know, they look good on paper. Dokken had sold more records at that point. They were more established. They had more records out on the charts and everything. But the fact that the management managed both those bands probably didn't help. Now let's talk about, obviously there's so many bands in here, but a band like Rat, obviously Piercy has made it known he moved to LA because of Van Halen. He said, man, there's something going on up here in the late 70s. And, you know, they moved up here from San Diego, and many people from Jake E. Lee to all sorts of people have been through that band. But obviously they came with not only some great songs and guitars like, you know, Warren DeMartini, but they had Beau Hill, which was a great producer for them. And they had this kind of look that was a little different. You know, they weren't quite the Wild Abandon and Motley Crue, but they still had that attitude. Like, we're here, you know, for all the girls and all the drugs. And, you know, talk about a band like Rat, because they kind of, you know, Piercy was, again, a guy never known for the greatest vocal ability, but they had a string, man. They had a string of hits, and, you know, Bon Jovi was their opening act at one point.
Yeah, I think Rat, it's interesting because if you look back at like 84 or 85, I mean, they're as big as anyone, as big as Motley Crue for sure. But they just didn't sustain in the same way. And again, like a lot of these bands, they just had a lot of internal stuff going on. And I think they were another band that maybe beyond Piercy and Robin Crosby, like who's to say how tight these guys really were? I think that there was a lot of angst going on as far as personalities. But Stephen Piercy's an interesting character, and he's a big character in the book, especially the first half of the book, because he is this guy who is right in the thick of it. And yeah, he came up from San Diego, but he knew the history because he had been up to LA a lot. He had seen Van Halen. He talks about sitting on the edge of the stage, I think at the Whiskey while they're playing. And, you know, he had interaction with Roth and with Eddie. And like, he knew that this was something that he had to get up there and be a part of. And when Rat went up to LA, like they got right in it. And whether it was being a house band at Kazari's and playing with, you know, Stryper every week, or then moving up to the Whiskey and taking on management from Marshall Burl, who worked at the Whiskey, but had also managed Van Halen in the early days. And he was this guy who was not going to let anything stop him, much like Nicky a year before him and Bret Michaels 2 years after him. And you see a few of these characters where it's almost like even the other people who are witnessing this going on, it's like inevitable that these guys are going to make it, because there's just no way that they're going to stop until they do. And he was one of those guys. Like Rat doesn't, you know, I mean, yes, Rat doesn't exist without Piercy because he started it, but it also doesn't exist because no one was going to have that same sort of drive to make sure it happened the way he did.
Yeah, and also they had, I mean, Warren is, like, to me, he's one of the greatest, or like he's in the top. He's such a good guitar player. I think he really, that's one of these cases too where the lead guitar player, I mean, it happened a lot in this era, but in Rat, Warren is truly elevating that band. And I think they had great songs. And I think that that's really, you know, when it comes down to it, that's what really separates the bands that made it on a lot of levels from the other ones. It's like, do you have the tunes? You know, can you come out with, do you have catchy, really good song? And I think Beau Hill worked them really hard. I mean, from what I could tell when I spoke to him, like he really, he was of the producers of that era, he was one of the ones who really pushed the bands, you know, like really got in their faces and made them work. I think that's why probably, you know, not the bands aren't all like, oh, I love Beau Hill, he's the best dude ever, but he got results from these bands. You know, he really pushed them to refine their songs and to deliver these great performances. So, you know, I think Rat and Rat just had the ambition too. So they were right place, right time, and the right songs, and an awesome guitar player. Like you can't really ask for more.
Yeah, yeah. Well, with so many bands, let's talk about the group Wasp, because very interesting. When I'm starting to promote Motley Crue, Blackie Lawless was around. Of course, Blackie was, you know, around London, you know, where Nicky was, and there was a group called Sister, and Chris Holmes was around, and you know, all of a sudden Motley takes off, and Wasp just had this amazing stage show. They'd be playing the Troubadour, and they'd have the girl in the rack, and they'd have the sign, you know, on fire, and they were, you know, throwing meat on the audience. I mean, it was just an amazing attitude, but they had this kind of darker image, but they had that Motley Crue, like, you know, we're going to do all the girls and we're going to do all the booze. You know, it was a little less drug oriented than Motley Crue, but, you know, they had this wild stage show. And at the time, people wondering, like, is this going to be the new Kiss? You know, they had Iron Maiden management, and you know, unfortunately, I don't think they had the songs. You know, the shock value wore off after a while, and they didn't become what we thought they were going to be. Talk about Wasp.
Rich, this is all.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I'm a big Wasp fan, but I would also agree with you that yeah, there's something about what they were doing. Well, what they were doing in the early days was super unique, and yeah, of course, there was this history of shock rock. But as you mentioned, I mean, if you walk into the Troubadour in 1982, 1983, and you see all this going on, the fire sign and the raw meat and Blackie's, you know, saw blade codpiece and all this stuff, the girl in the rack, like this is a show that you're not going to see anywhere else, and like it's going to stop you in your tracks, and that's a show that you won't, even 40 years later, you're not going to see that. So they were creating all this in a garage in some suburb, which is chronicled in the book in great detail. So they had this enormously creative thing going on. As for the song, and they had some really good songs. Like I don't know that they translated to record the way a lot of these other bands did. And you also brought up the point, like, yeah, it's a much darker vibe that they have going on. Like there's a Kiss thing to it, there's a Motley thing to it, but without any of the sort of poppiness or the sexiness or any of that. It wasn't going to work for a mainstream audience. Like it's not surprising that they didn't sell millions and millions of records. It just wasn't going to reach, you know, mainstream America in the suburbs in the same way. But what they were doing in the clubs was really special. And so we thought it was important to chronicle that and to really, as another example of showing like, look at what these guys that really had no resources and nothing to their name. And when I say these guys, I mean Wasp and all these other bands that were around that time were able to sort of create out of nothing. And that's what a lot of this scene was created out of, nothing. And it just made, but these bands made it into something, and the people started coming out in droves. And from there, you know, you have the, you know, America and then the world at large really following.